Bonjour, bonsoir et bienvenue à Rendez Vous avec Yasmin
et Kumar. Today we dedicate our program to Minnette de Silva, the first woman architect of Sri Lanka.
She'd made a difference for women. I mean, she was the first woman architect, I believe. And I think she had to fight her being an architect and going out in the world and not getting married, I mean, and doing this as a profession would help others, although Aunt Minette had a bit of a problem being an architect. My grandfather was not very happy about it. I mean, she had a very, very tough time because the men having a woman in their midst was not a happy scenario. It was a great inspiration because I had a lot of people sort of saying, well, you do that, what would people think? I mean, to hell with what people think, you know. I mean, that's what keeps one down.
I got to know Minette in 1973 when I rented with two other British people, two British teachers, female teachers, St George's, which was the house she had inherited from her parents. She had shown some interest in meeting me because she knew that I was living in Pereira campus and that I was a Commonwealth scholar and I was doing a PhD in politics. And as her father was a politician, she was quite interested to meet me. This woman came out dressed entirely in a Punjabi kit with turned up Persian slippers, all bejeweled and sparkly and spangly, and her hair all oiled and flowers, jasmine in her hair. And she opened the door and said, "Please do come in this low, deep, very British voice." And I thought, oh. And on the wall there were very interesting drawings. And I looked at the drawings and she said, "Oh, you're admiring my Le Corbusiers." And I said, "Oh, they're by Le Corbusier." And she said, "Have you heard of him?" And I said, yes, he was a famous French. She said, French-Swiss. I said, "All right, French-Swiss architect." Ah. So anyway, from then on, we clicked. And particularly when I told her that I was studying the period of the Donoughmore Constitution, when her father, George E. de Silva, had been a minister, she decided that she was going to rent the house to us. Anyway, I was absolutely fascinated with this woman who had been all over the world, who knew to talk about, in a very personal way, about all the people she knew, Le Corbusier, Mulk Raj Anand. She'd met Picasso. She was a friend of Jacob Epstein, the famous British sculptor. She knew Ravi Shankar, right? And, you know, the more she talked, the more she talked about her life and her life history, the more kind of dazzled I became. But she was always beautifully dressed. And she always had something very interesting to say. And particularly, she had a way of opening a person's eyes to the architecture of the world around them. Whether it was the architecture of a building, or the architecture of a tree, or the architecture of an entire landscape, she really understood what architecture was. She was a global citizen, and there were photographs around the walls. There was one photograph of Gandhi, which he had signed to Minette, because she knew him. She had been part of the Quit India movement in 1952. She had in fact been thrown out of Architectural College in Bombay because she had gone for demonstrations. She was a founding editor of the Indian magazine Marg. Minette had traveled the world and looked at the architecture of the world. But when she came back to Sri Lanka or Ceylon, what she found there was the truth of Ananda Coomarasamy. She was a great believer in Ananda Coomarasamy book on the medieval art of Sri Lanka. And in Kandy, in the 50s, you could still find all those artisans. The Dumbara mat weavers, the carvers, the lacquer workers. So she began a path that was then followed by so many other architects who don't give her any credit for it, but, you know, they started to introduce her ideas, the Madamidana, right, bringing the outside into the inside. The veranda which goes straight into the garden, so the inside becomes the outside. You're using of kabuk on interior spaces as well as exterior spaces without plastering. The use of lacquerware grills and balustrades, of putting dumbra mats for doorways and using temple painters to come and paint things. I mean, all these craftsmen she understood, she could speak the language, and not brilliantly. As I said, it was a very kind of drawly Sinhala that she spoke, which they found rather amusing. But nevertheless, she could communicate with them, and they understood that she really appreciated what they were doing as an artist to an artist. And that kind of communication you cannot buy, right? That creates a bond, and so people who did work for her did some of their best ever work. She said one day to me, she said, "You're studying Sri Lankan politics. Have you ever been to Gadladenia?" And I said, "Where?" And she said, "Gadladenia? You haven't been to Gadladenia? Have you been to Ambedkar? Have you been to Lankatilaka?" And I said, "No." I didn't even know what she was talking about. She said, "Right, get in the car." And we went off, and she drove me, which was always a frightening experience. She drove me first to Gadladenia, and she explained the entire temple to me. Then we drove to Ambedkar, and she explained again what this Diwali was. And I realized that she had used the dancing figure, and she used that, and she used to put it as a tile. She'd had it turned into ceramic. She used to stick it on the outside of her buildings, like her signature. And then we went up and up and up to Lankatilaka, which she adored. And then she took me through Lankatilaka, and bit by bit showed me the painting, showed me the architecture, and she said, "This is a pinnacle." It changed my perspective, which had been quite narrow and very focused on politics. And it opened it out into much broader perspective. And for that I'm ever grateful, and I think that is why I am here today, because Minette has sent me, because she wants finally to get her due.
This exhibition looks at the Watapuluwa housing scheme, which is one of Sri Lanka's first housing schemes. And the scheme itself was focused on providing housing for government civil servants. And this was a group of people who came from, importantly, different ethnic and different religious backgrounds. And the ground plan behind me actually shows the site itself, which is 88 acres. The architect that was chosen for this scheme was unusually a woman, because at that time in 1954 there were no women architects in Sri Lanka other than Minnette de Silva. She was in fact the first woman architect to qualify as a professional. She qualified in 1948 and was awarded by the Royal Institute of British Architects with the honour of being the first Asian woman architect. This exhibition is a really important one, we feel, because it's starting to look in close detail at the work of Minnette de Silva. She's an overlooked figure, and her work deserves to be looked at in much greater detail with more scrutiny. And this is an exhibition that just looks at one project, the housing scheme. And our hope is that it will encourage other people to look at her work one project at a time.
Minette shared a decades-long friendship with the French modernist architect Le Corbusier. Le Corbusier was invited by India's first Prime Minister Jawaharlal Nehru in 1951 to design and build Chandika as a city of the future in the plains of Punjab and the shadow of the Himalayas.
And he was fascinated by her. Le Corbusier called her Le Petit oiseau de l'île, meaning the little bird from the island. And she was like that. She was like an exotic little bird. She was very small.
I was, I think, his first encounter with India.
Moi, je suis le corbeau, et le corbeau regarde les fleurs avec passion. Mais les fleurs l'ignorent. J'embrasse Minette, le bout de vos doigts.